So I can see lots of interesting things that we'll talk about in a minute, but just before we get to, again, seeing how this might pan out in terms of how civilizations talk to each other, let's talk about universities. Is there a similar difference when we get to university level? Because it seems as though the university, unlike the school, has a much more international flavor. It's, it's kind of a more global, and so you kind of expect a kind of similar sort of language or a flattening out of the differences in universities, which you might not find at the lower levels of education, in schools and so on.
Well, my interest in universities is obviously not unrelated to the fact that I've spent my whole life in them. Yeah. But people often do spend their whole lives in them and then never much reflect on them. It's extraordinary to me now, looking back, that nearly all my colleagues have never really thought about what the purpose of a university is or what they're doing there, or certainly done any analysis of what they're doing there. They've gone through it. I think part of the reason that perhaps I got interested in this is that I moved around a bit. Quite a lot of my colleagues have been at a university, and then if they've stayed in university life, they've stayed in that university or something similar. I was at Oxford for 6 years. Then I went to the London School of Economics for 2 years, which was a big shock between a city university and a collegiate university, and then to the School of Oriental and African Studies, which I was just peripherally at, and then to Cambridge. And it surprised me. I thought universities were all alike, but not only were the universities very different, though Oxford and Cambridge were pretty similar, but even within a discipline like anthropology, they were different communities. They spoke a different language. They had different myths and stories about their origins and different interests. So I began to see how diverse even British universities were. But I got particularly interested in the subject towards the end of my time at Cambridge. I had kept everything, and so I had all my accounts of my students and examinations and administration and everything. So I have upstairs the whole life of a university that I was at Cambridge for 45 years in boxes. But just as I was retiring, and I think partly as a therapy, because it's quite traumatic if you've been given your whole life and soul to an institution to leave it, as you know, leaving schools. Partly because of that, and partly because I was asked by a friend at Oxford to write the introduction to a book on Oxford anthropology. And I thought I'd write a humorous introduction in which I played with the idea that anthropology at Oxford was really what the Oxford anthropologists did was basically write about Oxford when they went to Africa. So the kind of studies of witchcraft and ritual and communities and feuding and how African and other societies worked was basically high table life at Oxford, which is something similar to what Ernest Gellner did in his Words and Things at the end. And I found this amusing, but also interesting, because what it showed was that my own academic intellectual life, wherever I went, was conditioned by the way in which I operated in Cambridge. So I wrote in my last year a book called Reflections on Cambridge. And the moment I started writing, I realized how odd it was that this was the only book that had ever been written like this, because as an anthropologist practicing participant observation, where else had I participated and observed more than my 40 years up till then in Cambridge University? Here I was. And it was a perfect locus, because anthropologists like a kind of bounded community with some kind of walls around it. And they like something which is multi-level. Modern confused atomistic life is difficult to analyze as an anthropologist. But if you've got an institution like Cambridge University, in particular a college, which is religious, social, intellectual, sporting, all together, then it's the perfect place to do anthropology. So this book was a mixture of a history of Cambridge, which is very important. You can't understand an old university, 800 years, without seeing its history in some detail, but also particularly looking at it as if I was an outside anthropologist. And I got this idea partly from my friend Peter Burke, who did a study like this of his Cambridge College, Emmanuel. So what were its customs? What was its language? How did people joke in it? How did they dress up? How did they speak? You know, the sort of things, if you were going to a Himalayan community, you would look at the kinship relations, the family relation. So it's an anthropological study of a great university. And I learned a huge amount from that and from restudying my life through Oxford in my autobiography. Now, when I came to look at that in comparison to going to China in particular and Japan and so on, I found that you're right that there's a sort of universal language of universities, which is stronger than schools. I mean, the British educational system particularly affected India and other parts of the world. So there is a formal similarity. They sit in classes behind desks and they have teachers drawing on blackboards and things, but they're also very different. Universities, there's a little more similarity, often because they were founded much later than the schooling system. I mean, the Chinese universities are only a little over 100 years old, the first modern universities, and the same in Japan and elsewhere. So it's a fairly modern phenomenon. It was often started, strongly influenced by American and British universities or French universities. So they were set up by people who took their models from Western universities. And so at first sight, they look very similar. But also, as I came to understand them more, though there was more overlap, there was also a great difference. And it was similar to the difference of schools. That is that the university, well, to take two very dramatic ones, I thought of universities as the final stage in a kind of training and then an allocation to your life's work. So you came to Cambridge, and depending on whether you got a first or a second or a third or whatever, and what subject, this was partly determining where you went. Now, I'd taken that idea to Japan, and for 3 months, I was at the top Japanese university, Tokyo University, and I was amazed to find that the students hardly did any work at all there, because they worked incredibly hard. And this is another thing to say, that because of the concentration on the mind and the importance of moving up through this examination system, Chinese and Japanese students work twice as hard, at least, as British students. And they'd worked incredibly hard in Japanese schools from kindergarten onwards. But the moment they got to university, they just stopped, because your life was determined not on what you did at university, but which university you went to and which part of that university. So if you went to Tokyo Law School, you were assured of an absolutely top-rate job in the civil service or bank or something like that. Didn't matter what your exam results were. Hardly any of them became lawyers. They would go into certain things, like doing PPE at Oxford nowadays. You know, it's a surefire start for going into politics and so on. So basically, university was just the final stamp on where you got to. Now, that was partly true of China, because you could only get to those very, very top universities, Tsinghua and Peking and so on, with, you know, 1 in 500,000 would get there. It's such a huge place. But they did also work quite hard there, harder, and it did matter to a large extent. One of my first students was very upset because she'd been told that she had to work really hard to get to Peking and do physics. But once she got there, it would be quite easy, but it wasn't. It was hard work, nuclear physics. So they worked them hard, but they didn't They don't, again, they don't regard it, as British universities do, as the final stage in the training of character and habitus. In other words, just to take one example, probably almost the most important thing about Cambridge are the clubs. The footlights, if you're going into drama, or the poetry society, if you're going to poetry, or the sports clubs, if you're going into that world. There are hundreds of Cambridge and Oxford clubs. And it's there that you discover that you are really interested in something more than in your work. Your work is the background. So rowing or acting or whatever is your life, really, for many people. And it's normal to tell your students, you know, work hard, but don't overdo it, because the other things, friendship, conversations, going out, hunting, walking, playing music, enjoying the whole ambiance and learning to be a rounded person in the final stages. You are learning to be a gentleman or a gentlewoman. Now, there was none of that in Tsinghua University. There were no clubs. There was no common rooms. There was hardly any social life except dormitories and small subgroups. And it was the same with the teachers. They hardly met. I mean, in the Japanese universities, the teachers, there was no common room even within a faculty or department. They would have particular friendships and networks, but the social side and the interest, the hobbies, the games, many of them have very small sporting facilities, no orchestras and choirs and so on, or hardly any. So basically it was all, again, concentrated on the mind, but not the body and the spirit and the heart. And that was a big difference. But that also recently is changing a lot.